Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, Young Adult Librarian Extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Terrace Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee from the Children's Room.
In honor of National Poetry Month, we are continuing our month-long celebration of poetry. This has been something I've been discussing, and every time I give the same disclaimer.
You do.
That I'm giving my personal view of poetry as I see it. I am a poet, or at least was some time ago. And so I'm looking at things through basically my point of view, at the same time trying to explain why poetry is cool and why everybody should be involved with it. So that being said, in the last 2 weeks, I've discussed something called Poetry Slam. And every time I defer from explaining what I mean by that. So some people, like Solitaire, are desperate to know exactly what I mean by Poetry Slam. Poetry Slam is basically competitive performance poetry. Mm-hmm. Now, the origin of slam goes back a ways. Basically, like most people, I grew up, I liked poetry and I had my favorite poems, but I wasn't really aware of poetry as a living art form. Some teachers have a tendency to teach poetry as if all the great poets aren't with us anymore. You know, it's like teaching a drama class where like no one wrote a play after Shakespeare.
Right.
Poetry is a living art form, a dynamic art form that's growing and changing like all the time around us, but it's not taught like that. So I was completely ignorant there was anything exciting going on in the world of poetry. It was totally below my radar, but it was below the radar of most people, to be honest. In 1988, someone wrote an essay called "Who Killed Poetry?" He was an academician academia person, mm-hmm. who was basically saying that for a couple of generations, poetry teachers have failed to ignite a passion for poetry in student after student, therefore allowing the exciting part of poetry to basically die away. However, at the time that essay came out, it generated a lot of buzz and so forth, but he was already wrong at that time. Poetry had already been reinvented. No one just noticed it yet.
Right.
In 1986, a Chicago poet and construction worker and part-time poet named Mark Smith was doing a poetry reading at a jazz club called the Get Me High Lounge. And it was that kind of a club apparently. I've never been there. But people showed up, he read his own poetry, they read their poetry, and it was interesting, but basically it wasn't that exciting. And he didn't draw in that many numbers. And it dawned on him, like, how can we get more people to come through the door? How do we make poetry exciting? And it occurred to him that everybody loves a contest. Everybody loves a challenge, going head to head against another poet. And so if you go into a room and there's two people competing, you want to see who's won instinctively. Mm-hmm. So by making poetry into a contest that has winners and losers was basically a gimmick to trick people into sitting there and listening to a bunch of great poetry. At the Green Mill Tavern, he started the first slam venue in Chicago. Mm-hmm. And competitive poetry like that spread very rapidly across the country. So we started this in like 86, 87. By 1990, there was a national championship in San Francisco, which I think it only had 4 teams show up. But it snowballed. It was like the right idea for the right time. The 90s were ripe for something, and a whole generation of people wanted to express themselves. So it grew tremendously. The numbers going into the hundreds and then into the thousands. Poetry teams formed all across the country. Some states put out 3 or 4 different teams. Mm-hmm. California always had a couple of teams. New York State had a couple of teams. Rhode Island, the smallest state in the Union, had a team, the Providence team. So it was getting big. Now in 1996, so it is only 6 years after the whole idea was invented, a filmmaker named Mark Devlin showed up to do a documentary called Slam Nation, which I have right here on the table. Slam Nation is a documentary about the 1996 National Poetry Slam Championships in Seattle. It's a fascinating document. It's a time capsule of the best poets of their generation in the 90s. Some amazing people on there, some of whom went on to become famous. And it's a fascinating look at a competition, a sport. And it has so many fantastic performances. I just can't even begin to list them all. Some incredible people in that. But it also has kind of a trick to it, which I won't spoil. I believe Mr. Devlin, and I haven't spoken to him about this, but I'm pretty sure he started out to make a different kind of documentary. And he got swept up into what was going on. And let's just say, in a competition, you never know who's going to win and who's going to lose. It turned out, by an amazing twist of fate, or whatever, or enormous talent, the team from Providence won. And that team included people who were friends of mine, people I was very close to. And it was just an amazing performance, and they came back and they were the champions.
Wow.
And that definitely galvanized the New England poetry scene, and definitely in Rhode Island, all of a sudden was on the poetry map. And I didn't even know there was a poetry map until this point.
Okay.
Now, I started showing up at a weekly reading where there was not a slam venue. This person who ran the reading didn't like slam because she thought it emphasized the wrong aspect of poetry. And I totally understood that. I knew where she was coming from. I even agreed with her to a certain extent. But I liked the poems that I was writing. The audience liked them. But I felt I could do better. And I saw people that I knew who were putting it on the line in front of these huge audiences, pitting themselves against the best poets of the country. And I thought, why not me? Why can't I do that? So I did. So a year later, in 1997, I made my first slam team.
I didn't realize you actually had created a team.
It wasn't my team, but in those days you slammed, and the top four, you had to win a certain number of slams to get into the finals. And then in the finals, the top four poets went to the championships. And so I managed to make it into the top four of the finals more than once. The first year was 97, we went to Connecticut. So we were the Providence team, who technically were the winning team from the previous year. I say technically because no one who was on the winning team actually stayed slamming for Providence.
Right.
They scattered to the four winds that are slamming for other teams. Many of them became the anchormen of some really great teams in Boston and Worcester and so forth. So I went to Connecticut, had a great time. It was overwhelming. Poetry was very good for me. Slam poetry improved my performance and improved my writing, made me think about myself differently, think about the world differently, get exposed to voices from all across the country, very different ways of looking at things. And I had a wonderful time. And I wound up slamming on the national teams a couple of times. I did it again in 98. This time I was slamming for Worcester. 98 was not a great year for us. I later wrote a poem about that. We were in Austin, Texas, and I wrote a poem that starts with the line, in Austin that summer the sun was so hot it burned the poetry from our brains. When I think about Austin in 98, it's like a fever dream. I can recall bits and pieces of it, but like, it all just sort of fades away. And again in 1999 in Chicago.
Okay.
Chicago is a very big city, major poetry venue, the home of Mark Smith, where Poetry Slam first began.
You mentioned the intermingling of these different perspectives from different parts of the country.
Yeah.
So do you recall, a specific perspective or experience that really just caught your attention, that it was just so different?
Not a single person stood out. There's different ways of looking at the world. Because the world of hip-hop very quickly folded into slam poetry because of the similarities in styles.
Okay.
So you heard a lot of very authentic voices from the streets, things that I, obviously, as a white kid, had zero experience in. There's a lot of fantastic people out there. And we had a huge range of people. We had elderly people, we had very young people, people who were minors at the time, who sometimes had a hard time getting into the venues that are frequently held in bars.
Right.
We had to get special dispensation from the cops to get somebody into one of the venues because it served alcohol. So there's a huge variety of voices. Slam has always been about diversity and inclusion. In fact, women and minority poets have been in the top rungs of slam virtually since the beginning.
Cool.
Which is pretty amazing. After that, I volunteered in 2000 because the slam was in Providence, being run by other friends of mine. So I volunteered to help out with that. It didn't compete. And then I turned my back on slam because stuff happened in my life. Good stuff happened. I met the woman that I'm now married to. I also got this job at this library, which filled up a lot of my spare time. And I also went to work at a Renaissance fair that filled up the rest of my spare time.
Right.
So being a poet was exciting, exhilarating, but also exhausting and time-consuming. When I was really into the game, I was going to 5 or 6 readings a week. Sometimes every night of the week there'd be a poetry reading somewhere.
I wouldn't say you turned your back on it. You evolved.
Yeah. And of course, there's been so much water under the bridge since those days. It's been, 20, 21 years.
Right.
That many of the poets I worked with, have also retired. One of them who was in Slam Nation passed away just like a month ago.
Right.
Even though I didn't know him at all, it still hit me.
Yeah.
Because he was part of that generation that I slammed against,
Yeah.
And then, amazingly, in 2003, I wound up on the Worcester team again and went back to Chicago and ironically had my best year ever at a slam.
Very cool. So wait, 2003 was
Yeah.
after you had...
Yeah, I'd already stopped slamming and competing competitively, but I
Okay.
came back anyway for the finals in Worcester and wound up sort of accidentally making the team.
Very cool.
Yeah, I
One
felt a little
last
bad
big
about
hurrah.
that. Yeah, so I went out with a bang. That was my best year ever.
Very
And that was the
cool.
closest we came to actually winning it all. We still didn't make it to the finals. We only kept away by 1/10 of a point, but still.
That is impressive. So you mentioned that you had, speaking about the perspectives of the way that poetry was done, and seeing the woman's point, but also
Yeah.
sort of having your own ideas about it as well. I was curious if the idea of turning something that is, art into a contest, do you feel like it deters at all?
In some ways. I'm going to get to that in a second. That's my next topic. First, I still haven't said exactly what a slam is. It is competitive performance poetry.
We should leave
However,
it a mystery.
there are definite rules you have to follow, which is what separates it from any bunch of people getting together and just reading poetry at each other. First of all, you has to be your own poem.
Okay.
Unless you're on a team and you're doing a multi-voice piece, obviously you can appear in somebody else's poem. But it has to be your poem. It has to be 3 minutes or less in length. You're not allowed to use music, although I have performed in front of a live jazz band, which is very cool. You're not allowed to use props or costumes of any sort. It's you up there on a completely bare stage with a microphone, probably if you're lucky, and you do what you do. You're judged by 5 people chosen completely randomly from the audience. And they're given scorecards and they write down the score from 0 to 10. And they hold up their scores and all those numbers are added up, and then the judges, they drop the top score and they drop the lowest score to give you a number in the middle, and those numbers are added up. So the best possible score you can get in a poetry slam is 30, and the worst possible score you can get is a 0. So having your poems judged by 5 random people you've never met before is really gut-wrenching. It can be incredibly frustrating. The times you do a piece, you just know it doesn't connect.
Yeah.
And there's nothing you can do about it. There are times when the room is against you, again, usually for no real reason. If a poet goes before you, is in a particular style of poet, and he really has everybody rocking to his groove, and you come up there and do something totally different,
Yeah.
it's not going to work.
Yep.
And you can't help that. There's endless debate as to, should I go with funny tonight, should I go with serious? No, it's a tragic night, I think. The more poems you have in your repertoire, the better. So basically, it's brutal competition. Some people take it very, very seriously, perhaps a little too seriously. But like everything else, the more you put into it, the more you get out of it. You really have to put yourself out there. And the audience can tell if you're holding back. You get 3 minutes, which when I say 3 minutes, it probably sounds to you like a short amount of time.
Not exactly. Not after this last year.
Yeah. But the thing is, you stand there on the stage and you look out to the sea of faces,
Yeah.
and they're all waiting for you to do something spectacular.
It's a lot of pressure.
Yeah. They want to laugh, they want to cry, they want to remember that first time they fell in love. They want something from you, and you have to give it to them, and you have 3 whole minutes to do it. That's a lot of seconds, you know.
It really
I used
is.
to have a poem that I did, and I actually had the poem down, and I could do it in a minute. And my coach, Ray Davey, said, you know, Ed, you have 3 whole minutes up in that stage. Slow it down.
Yeah.
And now I do the poem in like 2.5 minutes. Same exact poem. So yeah, that is what it's like. I thought it was amazing. It made me a better poet. And all the things I said in my How to Write Poetry in the previous weeks, you know, every word has to do extra duty and things like that.
Right.
When you're on stage, it's your job to put all that emphasis into the words so they know exactly what all the words you're using mean. Many people don't like slam. They just don't. Like I said, the person who hosted Spoken Word, my first poetry venue, I love her to pieces. She's great. And she respected me because I started doing slam, but she won't do it. And I get her reasons. There's a lot of things people criticize about slam. First of all, why do you have to compete?
Mm-hmm.
If you have a poem that's heartfelt and meaningful, you shouldn't have to put it in competition against other people. Mm-hmm. That detracts a lot from what poetry is. And it's true that most poetry slams have an open mic section. So if you see something advertised that says poetry slam, it'll almost always say open mic as well. So you can go and just read in the open mic and not be in competition. And you can get the same feel of being in front of that room full of people that's buzzing with energy and so forth, but you're not putting it in competition. Mm-hmm. You're just there to perform. And many of the readings that I go to, of course, don't have a competitive element. They're just poetry readings. And that's where you practice and rehearse for when you get to a slam. But reading in public without competition is great, and I highly recommend it. Don't be afraid to get into this whole scene because you think it's all about competition, because it's not. Also, because it is performance poetry, you have a problem with style over substance. Sometimes the way the poem is presented overshadows the poem. The poem itself can be very shallow, but if the poet is really flashy or really sexy or really something, they can connect with the audience in a way that the very shallow words are just ignored in favor of the flashy performance.
Right.
I've seen that happen, and it makes me very sad. But the judges go by their instincts. They go by how the poet makes them feel. And if the flashy performance made them feel a certain way, they'll give them a high number because of that. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing you can do about it. There were people in the poetry venue that became so popular that they were famous enough when they walked on the stage, the crowd just went crazy, clapping and applauding and everything. And so that automatically gives them an edge. Everybody already loves them.
Yeah.
You know, one of my friends from Boston, Patricia Smith, won the individual championships and was on teams that won team championships several years in a row. And I never heard her say this out loud, but she stopped competing as an individual poet because she'd already won several years, you know, and she was very famous in the community. She wound up writing for the Boston Globe and Ms. Magazine and everything. So, you know, having to compete against her in a slam would be really super difficult. And some people have complained that there was a uniformity of style in slam poetry. Certain types of poems tend to score really well with audiences, and if one type of poetry is doing well, then everybody will try to do that. And there became a certain rhythm to slam poetry. Things that were very confrontational, in your face, a little bit angry, streetwise, whether you grew up on the streets or not. There was actually someone who wrote to Reddit asking the question, why is slam poetry so bad? And the answer they got was because it all sounds exactly alike, someone said. Which of course, it wasn't true in my day, and I'm sure it's not true now. But certain styles of poetry go over really well with audiences. And that tends to lead to certain people becoming popular. Then everyone wants to emulate them and get popular too. And so it gets away from the poetry, it gets away from the words pretty quickly when that happens. And again, that's sad, but sometimes there's not much you can do about it.
It's not altogether different from music.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. A superstar can put out an album that's really not that good and still have it be a million seller,
Yeah.
just on their name alone.
Yep.
It's also true because I went to several different poetry readings. I would always go to the Providence reading, which is twice a month, and then the Worcester was every Sunday, and Cantab was every Wednesday. I would always go to those three. And I would go to other ones like the URI reading whenever I got the chance. So again, I would go to like 4 or 5 poetry readings every single week, and every room was different.
Right.
Every venue has a different vibe to it. Every group of people has a different style. Some places, I slammed more in Worcester because my style didn't go over as well in Providence that I've noticed.
Were there performers who, they were so fluid that they could just emulate the vibe?
Yes. There were some kind of geniuses. He'll probably hate me if I say this out loud, but Taylor Malley was like the evil genius of poetry. He was really amazingly talented, a brilliant performer, a fantastic writer, but he thought a lot about his performance. And he could read a room like nobody's business. He was very, very talented. Definitely like the cream of the crop. He features prominently in Slam Nation. But the thing is, you write a poem and it comes from your heart. And not everyone has a briefcase full of poems they can dip into.
Right.
Not every poem I've written is nearly good enough to slam with. Some of them are just cute poems. Some are fun poems I like to read. And you have to have a killer poem to slam. Mm-hmm. You have to have a really good piece. And in competition, when you go to the national championships, you have 2 rounds. And you have to win both of them basically to get into the semifinals. And you win there to go to the finals and get on the big stage. Mm-hmm. So you're not allowed to repeat your poems till you get to the finals. So if you think you have a decent shot at making the semifinals, you don't burn off your best poem in the first round.
Right.
On the other hand, you have to win the first round.
Right.
Which is tough. I was in a slam one time that wound up being a tie at the end between me and another poet. Literally an exact tie. And I had at that time 5 or 6 poems I considered slam worthy.
Right.
And so I was able to grab one and do it. And the other guy did too, but his poem I felt was of inferior quality than the 3 that he'd chosen to slam with. And apparently the judges felt that way too, because I won. So the more poems you have, the better. But not, again, not every poem is right for every audience, and you shouldn't really try to change who you are. Poetry is about you, what's inside of you. So the competition in slam can be very detrimental. If you have a contest, you have a winner and a loser. We always say there are no losers here, but not everybody's going to be a winner. Basically, at the Nationals, every person has already won several local competitions.
Right.
So literally everyone at the Nationals is a quality poet. Yeah, they are all winners, literally. I remember I sat there in a room at the Connecticut Nationals, and I was just overwhelmed by the talent in the room. Every poet I'd ever heard of and poets I've never heard of that I was now completely in love with were all there. And someone said to me, someone I never met before, I don't know who he was, said to me, "What's wrong?" And I said, there's like the best poets in the world here. He said, "And you're one of them."
Aww.
No idea who he was. Never saw him again. So does that answer your question? I love slam. I think it was very good for me. But I'm not going to say it's perfect. There are a lot of problems with it. It was originally just a gimmick to draw people into poetry.
Right.
Now, from successive poetry slams and Slam Nation, Russell Simmons, entrepreneur,
Yep.
Got involved in all this. He produced Deaf Poetry Jam, which he made into a Broadway show that won a Tony. And Some of the poets in Slam Nation wound up in his deaf poetry on Broadway, and they were on an international tour, bringing this style of poetry literally all over the world. His Deaf Poetry Jam TV series ran for like 6 seasons, I think. It's all available on DVD right now, and a lot of the performances are on YouTube.
Of course, I knew Deaf Comedy Jam. I had no idea.
He spun off of Deaf Comedy Jam, Deaf Poetry Jam.
Yeah, no
He
idea.
rode that wave. He's a genius.
Very cool.
Yeah, he rode that wave, and it was very successful. He had a nice mix of poets. I tend to think personally he favored the New York poets over others. I'm saying that with a whole boatload of sour grapes because I auditioned and did not make it to Deaf Poetry Jam. So I entirely was too cool for them. I just didn't get my poems.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's what I'm going to go with.
I agree.
Yeah. Poetry right now, when I got involved in poetry, in a lot of ways, you had to go to a poetry reading to hear great poetry. Mm-hmm. But thanks to the internet being invented in the intervening years,
True.
There was an infinite amount of poetry available for free to everyone. If you type in slam poetry or performance poetry on YouTube, you'll get an endless row after row of some of the greatest poets you've ever heard of. Some of the classic poets that I slammed with are still there. Mm-hmm. A lot of fantastic stuff out there. And it's all available for free, on YouTube. If you feel like being deeply moved, look up Shane Koyzan, Shane, last name Koyczan. I was privileged to be in the room when he won the individual championships at the Nationals one year, and he's a incredibly brilliant poet, incredibly moving, very powerful words. I've seen him perform several times. He went on to do a poem at the opening of the Olympics in Canada. I'm sitting there watching it with my wife, and I go, I know him. That's Shane. He's got a lot of award-winning poetry. He has a fantastic site of his poems up. I highly recommend him. Do you have any questions?
I'd like to explore what the options and opportunities are for budding poets now. So maybe on an upcoming piece or something to consider in the future.
Well, I will say right now, unfortunately, this has been such a bad year for everyone that every venue I know got canceled for a year. And again, I don't read anymore, so I don't go to these venues. But you can search them online and find them.
Any idea whether any of it transitioned to occur virtually?
Some of it did.
Okay.
But I know the immediacy of being in the room was what everybody likes the most about it. It's what we all missed. And I know they will come back in some form. The Poetry Slam, International that funds the Nationals has broken apart and reformed at least once since I was last part of it.
Right.
But they're still out there. I know there'll be more venues in the future. Keep checking the internet.
Yep.
Search poetry readings in Rhode Island, or slam poetry in Rhode Island, or Massachusetts gives you a list that's 10 times as long.
Cool.
Can I tell one personal story before we go?
Of course.
All right. Like many people, I sometimes Google myself. I've discovered I'm actually a slightly older guy who plays with a jazz trio known as the Ed Fuqua Trio in New York. Sadly, I'm not the jazz performer from New York, but mostly that's the Ed Fuqua you get. I did discover, astonishingly, a reference to me in a YouTube piece. I say astonishing that anyone even remembers me from those days, since I wasn't filmed, so none of my old poems are up on YouTube. However, I'm name dropped in the San Francisco Poetry Slam. They referred to it as having a poet who Fuqua'd the scores. I became a verb. I don't know how this happened. It is true. They said Ed Fuqua was a Worcester slam poet famous for garnering huge point spreads. Because I have indeed, at the national championships, gotten both a 0 and a 10 for the exact same poem. I was notorious enough that the Poets in San Francisco, at a venue I've never even been to, made my name into a verb, which I'm very, very proud of.
That is very cool. Yeah, that's something. And I understand the frustration of, 0 and 10.
Yeah.
Same piece.
Mm-hmm.
That's rough.
Yeah, my fellow poet Dave I jumped on his chair and screamed, "His best friend was a junkie, what more do you want?" That was Austin. It was a rough night. Remember I told you about Austin? Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful town, great poetry, but yeah, not our year.
Makes for amazing memories, nonetheless.
It is, yeah. I'm trying to get too nostalgic because all my vision is of the past, but poetry is still alive. It is still going on right now. Not necessarily right now because of the pandemic, but it will all come back in some form.
It's not gone, it's within
Yeah.
us.
It is, definitely.
Yeah.
All right, that's more than all of our time. So until next time, I've been Ed.
Solitaire.
We'll see you again. Until then, be safe.